The background and purpose of this project is that it is based on a co-written chapter by Mr. Pamoja and myself for an upcoming edited work titled Beyond Borders with James Baldwin, A Practical Guide for Everyone. And the goal of the book is to examine how James Baldwin's work can be used in a broad range of settings rather than be academic or in community settings. So there's this effort to revitalize the work of James Baldwin to prove that it's still relevant in today's society. We decided to explore intersecting themes of religion, spirituality, and the black family relationships that are relative to James Baldwin's short stories, Exodus and Sonny Blues. The first story that I will briefly describe is Exodus, which was written in 1952 by James Baldwin. It's not recognized as much as Sonny Blues, but it's still no less important. Exodus is the story of a mother and her two children who were born and raised on the plantation. However, after emancipation had taken place, she was still living on the plantation, and her children, more specifically her daughter, was expected to stay in this motherly family role, living on the plantation still in isolation. So while she's seeking freedom, her surroundings has her in this plantation, so she wants to break free. So that's how we chose Exodus. We chose to follow up with Sonny Blues, which was written in 1957, because the story Exodus ends with her leaving out the door with her want to go to Harlem. And ironically, he picks up his Sonny Blues with a man living in Harlem. So we just kind of made that connection that Sonny Blues is just simply a continuation of Exodus. He just simply switched settings and gender. So as you know, Sonny Blues is one of his most canonical short stories. It's set up in racially stratified post-World War II Harlem, New York, where Baldwin grew up. It follows the narrator, Sonny, and his brother, a middle-income school teacher, and Sonny, who is a socially aware drug addict and jazz piano player. The story is about the brother's psychosocial struggle with existing race, class, and gender-based constructs of oppression. And also recounting in Exodus, it recounts several events surrounding Rachel's moment, who is the mother of emancipation during the American Civil War, and subsequently the family struggles with the race, gender, and class dimensions of oppression during the turn of the century. So as you see, these two stories intersect a great deal.
Next thing we want to pick up with is the approach that we took in sort of analyzing these two short stories, so Exodus and Sonny Blues. And ultimately, we saw both Sonny Blues and Exodus as critiques for looking at the African-American sense of religion and ultimately spirituality as well, and how African-American religion and spirituality is sort of inexorably tied to the black family and the black family experience. How that creates a tool for reclaiming humanity, black humanity, right? The approach also factored in the fact that Baldwin looked at Baldwin's own background with religion in terms of being the son of a preacher, as well as being a minister himself at some point in time in his early life, and also the more obvious aspects of social criticism, which are inherent within Baldwin's writings. And from that, from those two works, some of the themes that emerged, the two basic themes that emerged, was this notion of emphasis on religion and spirituality as a context for negotiating and examining dehumanization and oppression within the black experience, and also a more fundamental and nuanced observation of the nature of oppressive in the black experience. I mean, ultimately, moving forward in this approach, we framed our discussion around Exodus and Sonny Blues with several definitions of religion and spirituality. I believe you all may have your handouts. But the first definition was taken from Charles Long's Significations, and that definition of religion is an orientation in the ultimate sense that enables the individual to come to terms with the ultimate significance of one's place in the world. And in addition to religion as a definition, and sort of create the context here, we also selected two definitions of spirituality. The first definition comes from Paluzian's Handbook of the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality, and that definition of spirituality reads as such: an individual committed to certain values, ideas, goals that transcend the individuals themselves. The second definition of spirituality, drawn from the Handbook of African American Psychology by Madison Watson, was an individual's connection between transcendent forces and humans that results in the individual identifying with the sacredness of all things and a conscious commitment to live a life of virtue.
So when we look at this background information that we gave you, and then we look at the Black family scope in Exodus and Sonny Blues, we have to look at the Black woman's role as savior and what that means when we speak from a religion and spirituality point of view. As we know and can attest to, the Black family has survived on the unique dichotomy of maternal strength and the influence of religion. But what does religion really mean in this sense? Since the Black woman herself is influenced by religion, she becomes one with it, i.e. becoming our savior. The family obligations of the Black woman allows her to be seen as the savior of her family. She is seen as a neutral, counselor, authority figure. The sacredness of the Black woman's role as savior is very important because it is not as seen in other cultures as we see in the Black community, if that makes sense. The Black woman is the matriarch of the Black family. She is the backbone. She is the carrier of the tradition from generation to generation. She is who we look upon when we need guidance, which is very much the same way most people view traditional religion and their concept of God. Most people look at God for this nurturer, this counselor, this authority figure, i.e. their savior. But when we look at the Black family, the Black woman takes on this role, thus becoming one with religion. Okay? So the sacredness of this spirituality is not seen as the traditional European view of religion. At this time, it's important to understand the matriarchal dominance in the Black families as she works one-on-one with religion. And at this time, I would like to read a quote by Derek Bell that I particularly base my part of the chapter on, that I believe is very powerful. And I assume that Baldwin feels the same way that Bell does, in which Derek Bell states, Black men must understand that Black women know both what should be done and how best to do it in every aspect of our lives: business, educational, political, religious, economic, social, and personal. Just as we acknowledge the woman's power to give life, we must come to recognize their power to sustain us in life during critical times to come. Black women have always been the salvation secret of our people. So now we see this notion of Black women continue to be the savior of our people from beginning of generations and carrying this tradition on. So why is it that the Black woman is so open to take on this role? Unfortunately, we have this notion of absent fathers in the home. And when you look at Sonny Blues and Exodus, both fathers are indeed absent in the home. So therefore, you see the mother having to take this role as both the mother and the savior, which when you look at the traditional European sense of religion, the patriarchal aspect of it, she's taking on that maternal and patriarchal role, thus proving her dominance in the Black family. She's also expected to carry on the generational lessons, the expectations of both the mother and the children in the home. So she also tells the children, hey, this is how you need to grow up. This is how I'm molding you. This is the Black family. This is the Black culture. This is how we as a community thrive. And this is how children learn. And once again, you see that generation to generation because we learn and then we pass it down. And that's the role of the Black woman. Examples of this can be seen in Sonny Blues when the father failed to protect his brother from being killed by the racists. It was a racist Klan one night, and he describes how his brother was chased down and killed. So now you have this notion of the father not being able to protect the brother. Then when you go back to Exodus, it's Florence's views of her daughter and the role that she is expected to take on. So then now you see a neglect of the children not wanting to accept their generational roles that the parents are passing down. So then now we have to question the acceptance of the Black woman as the savior in the community today. And that's how we're trying to forward this, since we're trying to, since this is a piece in a book of how James Baldwin's work is used today, these are questions that we have to ask and assume and issues that he's raising.
And lastly, we just want to discuss a little bit more in terms of how we looked at the chapter, in particular the two short stories and the experiences of the characters themselves. And again, we go back and revisit how religion and spirituality sort of set a context for the psychosocial struggles of each of the characters in their dealings with oppression and racism. And ultimately, with Exodus, perhaps it's more obvious when you look at the title of Exodus, sort of the allegorical reference of African Americans or enslaved Africans to the ancient Hebrew children of Israel. But if you look a little bit closer, considering the definition of religion that we discussed earlier, that we introduced earlier, coming to terms with the ultimate significance of one's place in this world. In Exodus, as well as Sonny's Blues, you see all the characters in some way, shape, or form sort of struggle and negotiate with the constructs of race, class, and gender-based oppression to ultimately find themselves, find their identity, a knowledge of self, so to speak. Sonny and his brother, the narrator in Sonny's Blues, as well as Florence and Gabriel, the two children of Rachel, the mother, in Exodus. In addition to looking at religion as a frame for our discussion here, we also looked at spirituality, as I mentioned earlier. And when you consider the definition of spirituality in terms of a commitment to certain goals, values, and purposes that transcend individuals themselves, as well as the connection between transcendent forces and humans, that results in the identification of the sacredness of all things and a conscious commitment to ultimately a life of virtue, key word. When we look at, for instance, Exodus and Sonny's Blues, again, we see both of the main characters in particular sort of set this point of transcendence. And it's ultimately, when you put it in the context of spirituality, it sort of takes on a more broader sense of them attempting to move outside of their immediate existence. For instance, when we look at Exodus, the very end of the story, in Exodus, it all builds up to Florence engaging in an act of self-determination, reclaiming her womanhood, or beginning to reclaim her womanhood by deciding to leave the situation that she was in her home and literally walk out the door, hence her Exodus. And then also, and basically that allows her to carve out her own space in this world, going back to that ultimate sense of individual's position in society or in the world, as well as it characterizes her effort to transcend, again, those race-based and gender constructs of oppression, right? Also, when we look at Sonny and the narrator, Sonny's brother and Sonny's Blues, there's one particular scene at the very end again, when Baldwin lets all this mount up, right? Where ultimately Sonny and his brother are creating or experiencing a point of transcendence. Ultimately, when you look at the scene at the very end, where they're in the jazz club, it's very from the whole voyager journey from their house to the jazz club. Baldwin keeps making this reference to darkness, until Sonny gets on the stage. The spotlight shines on Sonny, and ultimately it's at that point in time that a sort of epiphany or a point of transcendence begins. And ultimately, there's one quote that I want to share that sort of illustrates this sort of notion of this point of transcendence, spiritual transcendence, that the narrator shares at the very end. And that is as follows. Freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us to be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did. And ultimately, this is not only suggestive or implies that whole notion of how one engages in spiritual transcendence, but also bring this back to the black family, the sort of intrafamilial dependency, that sort of collective notion of how we transcend ourselves, right?
Therefore, we have discussed through the scopes of religion, spirituality, and the black family. James Baldwin's short stories, Exodus and Sonny Blues, can serve as a practical guide for everyone, thinking about and discussing the wounds of oppression relative to African people. More importantly, healing wounds of oppression as it relates to African people. And for instance, black women and her community, in which the black woman must reclaim and revisit her role as savior, i.e. when we look at Derek Bell's quote, we have to remember that as black women, we are indeed the saviors, and in today's society and the purpose of conferences like this, I believe it is important for us to question our roles today and how we have moved further from our traditional roles as Savior in our community. So basically what we would like to do at the end of this particular presentation is to challenge the Black women in the audience and those of us who know women who are no longer taking on their roles as Saviors in the community to reclaim their roles so that way we can claim our community back. Thank you.